Hello everyone, and welcome to our next video. So next in anatomy, we are going to be talking about the endocrine system. The reason we're talking about this now, the last unit that we just talked about was the blood, lymphatic, and immune system, and this actually kind of closely ties together with this. It's kind of a nice overlap here between the endocrine system and the circulatory system in general. So let's dive into things. So for the endocrine system, we're going to think of this as being a control system of our body. And I add this little note here. It's going to be very kind of closely related to the nervous system in some ways. The nervous system we didn't talk about too long ago. We remember, the nervous system is going to use electrical impulses to control our body. These are going to be, if we look at our picture here, this is going to be our nerve cells. Thinking about those being connected to the spinal cord and the brain, this is going to be our body's main way of sending really quick, fast signals throughout the body that allow us to move. They allow us to respond to stimuli, to feel pain. They allow us to interact with our environment in a very quick manner. The nervous system is going to be fast. On the other hand, the endocrine system is also going to be a way that we send messages throughout our body, but we are going to use chemical messengers called hormones. And hormones are actually going to be quite slow compared to these electrical impulses that our nervous system uses. So you've probably heard of hormones before. These are really important when we think about growth and development in living things. Hormones play a very active role in allowing for development to happen when we go through puberty. They basically cause our body to change. They cause our body grow in different ways and for different parts of our body to become more developed. However, this is not the only role of hormones. We're going to start to break down other parts of the endocrine system, think about where did these hormones come from and what are the function of all these different hormones. One thing to keep in mind is that the major structure of the endocrine system are going to be called glands. So glands are going to be structured throughout our body. They're going to be responsible for releasing different types of hormones at different times. We're going to break some of these down, but just to start us off some examples, we have the pituitary gland. This is one of the most popular and probably one of the more important glands in our body. We find this in our brain. We also have the pineal gland, thyroid gland, the thymus, the pancreas, the adrenal gland, the testes, and the ovaries. These are going to be the main kind of glands that we find in the human body. And again, we'll break those down a little bit later. And these glands secrete hormones. That is their main function. All right, so to break down hormones into a little bit more detail, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the endocrine system is going to be very closely tied to our blood and to kind of our circulatory system, the way that chemicals and different cells move through our body. So hormones are going to travel through the bloodstream to get to our cells. Oftentimes, our hormones will be targeting specific cells in order to cause certain effects to happen in those cells. And there's going to be two major types of hormones that we think about. We're going to break it down into two major categories. The first type is going to be water soluble, which means that it dissolves in water. So it's more or less going to work well with water. It's going to prefer to stay in water-like environments. And these hormones, insulin is a popular example, cannot pass through the cell membrane, so they attach to a receptor on the cell membrane. So because these hormones are water soluble, they like water, when they try to get through a cell's membrane, which is going to be made up of lipids, they're not going to be able to pass through because these fatty molecules and water don't really mix well. So we can see this here in our first example. So we have, for example, these water-soluble hormones. These are going to get into our bloodstream, and once they reach the target cell, they're going to attach to something built into our cell membrane here called a signal receptor. So these hormones are going to bind to this signal receptor that's built into our cell membrane here, and that is going to cause usually an effect inside of our cells. So oftentimes it will send a signal to our nucleus, and there will be some sort of gene regulation, either turning on or turning off a certain gene. Again, genes are going to be parts of our DNA that code for certain proteins that can be created. So more or less, when we have these hormones binding to these receptors, it will often send a message to our nucleus to say, okay, we need to start making this protein to help our body, or we need to stop making this protein. We can also have what's called a cytoplasmic response. So this can be something that's happening inside of the cell, either certain molecules that are being activated inside of our target cell. Those are going to be kind of the two major responses that can come about because of this water-soluble hormone. The other type of hormone we're going to think about is going to be lipid soluble, or means it dissolves in fats. And these hormones, an example being testosterone, can pass through cell membrane and can attach to the receptors in the cytoplasm. So if we look at our second picture here, these are going to be lipid soluble hormones. So these are going to be pretty good at actually getting through our cell membrane here. As I mentioned, as we talked about here, our cell membrane is going to be made up of those phospholipids. So this hormone mixes well with those lipids, those fats. So it can pass straight through the cell membrane and actually directly target certain molecules or receptors inside of the cytoplasm or inside of the nucleus in order to carry out this kind of same goal of either gene regulation or a cytoplasmic response. So really the only difference here, water-soluble hormones are not able to pass through, so they activate a signal receptor built into the cell membrane, while a lipid-soluble hormone is going to be able to pass through our cell membrane and directly bind with a signal receptor inside of the cell. So that's the main difference between these two types of hormones. When we think about general functioning of hormones, hormone levels in the blood are regulated through negative feedback mechanisms in the body. So this is going way back to the beginning of the year when we talked about negative and positive feedback loops and maintaining homeostasis in our body. So oftentimes the levels of these hormones, whether or not they get released by our different glands in our body, that is going to be controlled by a negative feedback loop. So if we remember, a negative feedback loop is going to try to counteract something from happening. So for example, if we have too high of a certain chemical present in too high of levels of that chemical in our bloodstream, we may release a hormone that's going to cause the levels of that chemical to go down. So we're trying to counteract something. That's in opposition to a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback loop is the opposite, where we're trying to increase the signal. We're trying to increase the prevalence of something in our body. All right, so I mentioned this on the first slide, but now we're going to talk about the major glands of the endocrine system and just break them down a little bit more. So there are many glands and organs that make up our endocrine system. And we will focus on some of the main ones here. So the first one is going to be the pituitary gland. Again, we find that up here in the brain. And this is kind of what is considered to be the master endocrine gland. There's a lot of different hormones that are released by the pituitary gland, and they play a really important role in the overall development of human bodies. We also will notice that the pituitary gland is going to control many other glands. So this pituitary gland is going to be in charge of either activating or deactivating a lot of the other glands that we find in our body, as well as releasing its own hormones into the bloodstream. So the pituitary gland is kind of the main gland of the endocrine system. It's the main one you want to remember. We also have the pineal gland, which again is found up here in the brain. We have the thyroid gland, which is going to be kind of right up here in the throat area. We have the adrenal gland, which is going to be kind of right by the kidney here. This is going to be our kidney. So this has a lot of important functions with our kidney, the adrenal glands. We have our pancreas, which is right here, part of our digestive system. But it is also going to have some really important hormones that help to control the amount of blood sugar in our bloodstream. Then we have our ovaries. Hopefully we recognize that we do not find ovaries in all people. Ovaries are found in people who are biologically female. On the other hand, if you are biologically male, you're going to have testes on the other hand. So people, unless there's a certain genetic mutation, you're only going to have one of these two final glands. So people who are biologically female have ovaries, and people who are biologically male have testes. All right, so what I'm going to probably ask you to do now, I know that this is a lot of information at once, but this does a nice job of breaking down all of the glands that we just talked about and major hormones that those glands released and the function of those hormones. So what I'll probably ask you to do now is to just pause the video and copy this table into your notes. So go ahead and pause the video, and then I'll talk through this a little bit once you come back. Right. So the first kind of master gland of our body is the pituitary gland. One of the major hormones that it's responsible for releasing is the growth hormone, or we can think of this as HGH, human growth hormone. And this is going to target all cells of our body. So this is a really powerful hormone. And it's going to just be aimed at growth. We are trying to make more cells here. We are trying to increase the size of structure in our body. We're just trying to help our body to grow overall. The pineal gland, the major hormone that this releases is melatonin, and this promotes sleep. If any of you have ever had trouble sleeping in the past, you may have taken melatonin pills. So these are basically the same version of this hormone here that you're able to take to hopefully help you to sleep. But naturally, our body should be making some levels of melatonin using our pineal gland. The next one is the thyroid gland, and appropriately named, it releases the thyroid hormone, and this is going to stimulate metabolism. So again, metabolism, we talked about this earlier in the year as well. This is the process where we take in an energy source, we get energy from that, and then we're able to take down whatever we broke down, and we're able to use that to build up new things as well. So this thyroid hormone is going to stimulate metabolism. The adrenal glands, again, are kind of associated with our kidneys. However, they are going to be creating this hormone called epinephrine. And this is kind of what we can think of as adrenaline. And this is really helpful with our fight or flight reflex. So this kind of just sets our body on guard. We're able to relax. We're trying to make sure that we can move. We're increasing our ability to move and respond to stimuli better in that moment. You may also heard of EpiPens before. EpiPens are things that are given to people who are having a severe allergic reaction to something, and those are going to contain epinephrine. It's that same hormone in there that's going to help to kind of open back up those blood vessels that may be closing because of an allergic reaction. It's going to try to counteract our inflammatory response of an allergic reaction. It is also important to note that the adrenal gland is responsible for making small amounts of estrogen and testosterone. These are going to be, we'll touch on it in a second, but these are the main kind of hormones that induce different sex characteristics. So whether you have more female sex characteristics or more male sex characteristics. The pancreas, the two main ones that it have are insulin and glucagon. And these kind of have opposing functions to each other. So insulin is going to be responsible for lowering blood glucose levels, while glucagon is responsible for raising blood glucose levels. We hopefully remember glucose is going to be that major form of simple sugar that all of our cells use to do the process of cell respiration, where we take in glucose and get ATP, which we can use to do many, many things in our body, whether that's activating enzymes or whether that's allowing our muscles to function. So insulin and glucagon are going to be really important for making sure our blood glucose levels are not too high, but that they're also not too low as well. The ovaries, again, these are glands that are only found in people who are biologically female. Their main hormone that they're going to create is going to be estrogen. And estrogen is responsible for the development and maintenance of secondary sex characteristics in females. So again, estrogen is going to create more female sex characteristics. Also, the ovaries do create small amounts of testosterone. It is important to recognize that just because you may be biologically female or biologically male, that does not mean you only have the one hormone. Females are going to have mainly estrogen, but then also small amounts of testosterone in their bloodstream, while males are the opposite. They're going to have higher levels of testosterone in their bloodstream while also having small amounts of estrogen. And that we kind of think about as coming from the testes, mainly in people who are biologically male. So the testes are kind of the main male gland. They create testosterone, which is responsible for the development and maintenance of secondary sex characteristics in males. And again, very similar to the ovaries, the testes do create small amounts of estrogen. So know that's a lot of glands and a lot of hormones to remember. However, you do want to know and have a pretty good idea of what gland is responsible for creating what hormone and what that hormone then does. So definitely try to think about this table. It'll be important going forward. Now we're going to kind of jump back to where we were talking about hormones. We talked about them being controlled by negative feedback loops, but also the endocrine system plays a really important role in maintaining homeostasis in our body. So one of the hormones that we just talked about, one of the glands that we just talked about, was the pancreas creating the hormone insulin. As we mentioned, insulin is responsible for increasing blood glucose levels. That stimulates, whenever we have increased blood glucose levels, that stimulates the release of insulin. And this often happens after we eat. So once we take in a food source, our glucose levels are going to be higher, so then our body will release insulin for that. The insulin is going to signal our body cells to take in glucose from the bloodstream. So the best way that our body knows to lower blood glucose levels is to just take it out of the bloodstream and to take it into our cells. Our cells are then going to use that glucose to do cell respiration, but we're basically trying to regulate the level of glucose in our bloodstream. And after this, after that glucose does get taken in by our cells, our blood glucose level should decrease. And that's kind of shown in this little feedback loop. So if we have glucose levels rising after we eat, our pancreas releases insulin. This is going to cause cells in our liver in particular to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. This is a polymer of the molecule of glucose, which is a monomer. So you put a lot of glucose molecules together and you can form glycogen. But also, this is going to generally affect all of our body cells, and it's going to tell them to take up blood glucose levels, or they're going to take glucose into their cells until we reach the proper level of blood glucose that we're looking for here, which is going to be about 90 milligrams of glucose in our blood. The other half of this is another hormone that is released by our pancreas, and that's going to be glucagon. And glucagon basically has the opposite function of insulin. So when we have decreased blood glucose levels, this stimulates the release of glucagon. So if our blood glucose levels get too low, our pancreas notices that, and then our glucagon is going to be released by the pancreas. And the glucagon is going to basically do the opposite of insulin. It's going to signal liver cells to release glucose into the bloodstream. So while insulin told liver to take up glucose, to take it in, glucagon is going to tell the liver to basically put it back out into the bloodstream. And that should cause blood glucose levels to increase. And now we can see the other half of our loop here. So if blood glucose level drops below a set point, the pancreas will release glucagon, and glucagon directly targets cells in the liver that are going to break down glycogen into glucose. So up here, we stored glucose as glycogen. Now we're going to take that glycogen that we stored and break it down into glucose and release that into the bloodstream. So our body, again, is going to want to try to stay at this midpoint here of being 90 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters of blood. And if that level gets too high or too low, our pancreas will release either insulin or glucagon to help our body to be where it needs to be. All right, and that's going to wrap up our introduction to the endocrine system. Thanks for watching.